Greetings, Guardians. My name is Bife here. So apparently some of the Vex managed to look deep into the past of humanity to discover our greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses. You know what they took away from all of that? Apparently, phenomenal drip. Okay, but seriously, these are the Vex of the Tharsis Reformation, and they're part of one of the most interesting and exciting developments in Destiny's lore in quite a while, I think. And whilst Tharsis Reformation are fantastic, no, it's not just because of the drip. Today we're going to talk about how some Vex became independent, went rogue, and are now finding out what it is to be an individual, and why that is awesome for Destiny's story at large. So, first things first, to understand why all this matters, you need to understand that the Vex are not individual at all for the most part. The Vex are essentially made up of millions of radiolaria, the little particulate of white fluid that pilots the mechanical brass frames that you and I fight on the battlefield. More importantly, they're driven by the need to fulfill their pattern. What pattern, you ask? Well, I'll let Praedyth give you an introduction.
The Vex have no hope, no imagination, no drive, no fear. All they have is the pattern. Everything must fit. If it can be made to fit, good. If it can't, it gets cut away.
This pattern formed thanks to the supposed origins of the Vex, where they escaped from the Flower Game before time in the Black Garden, as the Winnower and the Gardener fought within its meadows and burned down the Tree of Silver Wings. Keep in mind, that's only a perspective given to us by the Winnower, so it may not necessarily be completely correct, but it does at least match with our understandings of the Vex. This pattern that the Vex follow is therefore essentially survivalist trauma taken to its extremes. It's a pattern that was formed that allowed them to be the ultimate victors within the Flower Game, a game where they ultimately needed to fight again for their own existence, and their pattern was successful. Therefore, the pattern is the force by which the causal forces of the Vex believe that they will become the ultimate victors at the end of the universe. The pattern is not a singular path, it is an idea. Vex supremacy, the crushing or submission of others, mathematically speaking, meaning that they will be the only ones left. Survival in spite of all other odds. All subtypes of Vex work towards enacting this pattern, they just do it in different ways. The Vex of the Infinite Forest sought to use its incredible calculations and the power of prediction that it granted them to infer what path they should follow into the future, to find a place where there was no light and no darkness. Meanwhile, the Hazen Lords of the Vault of Glass on Venus decided to manipulate time directly, and to force all of time to be subject to their will within the strange underworld they created beneath the Venusian surface, where time bends to their will, and where things can be expunged from the timeline if they do not meet the requirements of the pattern. And then there's the Sole Divisive, who, lacking any other viable option, sought to bind themselves to a paracausal force, namely the Witness. Their hope was that if it succeeded, they too would succeed, and would become a part of the final shape, a part of the universe that would survive beyond the rest. But all of a sudden, into all of this chaos, there came an interloper, the Conductor, Maya Sundaresh. She did many remarkable things to the Vex that she took control of with her Echo of Command on Nessus. These new choral Vex, otherwise known as the Nessian Schism, were remarkable, not only because they were individuals who had to abide by Maya's overwhelming commands, but because she forced them to stop being a collective intelligence, and instead allowed them to break from their overwhelming collective pattern. The individuality of the Vex of the Nessian Schism is the thing that really makes them different. As Ikora put it, Maya was creating a community out of a collective. This could have, in hindsight, been a really wonderful thing had Maya had different goals. Newly liberated Vex were beginning to understand the world around them as if they were newly born beings, and yet they explored the world with the full faculties of an incredibly intelligent being. Maya Sundaresh, however, didn't care for any of the desires of the Vex, and she would use her Echo to reconstitute and deconstruct those who did not serve her purposes. Most notably, there was a Vex Hobgoblin who decided that it would enact artistic measures to change its frame and make it more aesthetically pleasing to its own designs. However, Maya saw this as useless and immediately deconstructed it. With Maya at the helm, these independent Vex may have been limited, but they did begin to push the boundaries of what their existence was previously defined by. They had all been liberated from the pattern, and so some of these Vex began to act independently. There have been a ton of instances of stuff like this in the lore over the last year or so. From back in Echoes, we see examples of Vex units on Nessus proclaiming themselves to be Guardian Killers, or Vex who saw other life forms out on the Nessus surface and didn't just try to kill them on sight, but instead attempted a rudimentary greeting in the form of a wave. Most recently, here in the lore of the Edge of Fate, we've seen the Vex observing insects with childlike interest in the lore. Newly independent Vex were scouted by the Praxic Order, holding each other in what was described as a tender embrace, as if they were guarding each other against fears or anxiety. And then there's just the whole of the Turophile quest. In the process of this side quest on Kepler, a Vex frame was rescued by us, Lodi, and Orin, and we would come to know it as, I kid you not, Sharp Cheddar. It asked us to free it from other Vex by helping to fake its death, so that it could be smuggled away to safety. These independent Vex are all the result of Maya granting independence to members of the collective that fall under her control. But there's more to it than this. Maya would have otherwise crushed the Vex who sought to express anything that didn't fit her own plans. Therefore, something needed to happen that allowed these Vex a degree of freedom, particularly those such as Sharp Cheddar who broke away from the entirety of the Nessian Schism at large. That something was Maya's decision to demand that 3 trade the places of Earth from the Golden Age with Earth from the Post-Witness Age. In doing so, and in her tantrum, Maya pulled 3 from the 4th dimension to the 3rd dimension. Doing this killed a god, but it also caused major damage to the Echo of Command. You can actually see this within the Imminent Raid lorebook. Maya actually loses some of the communicated messages that she's receiving from the personality within the Echo, Tekal. From this point on, her control over the Choral Vex has begun to diminish. She is still a powerful foe, and she is able to command the overwhelming numbers of the Nessian Schism to conduct research on the Nine and Dark Matter. After all, those were still her Vex at the center of the Desert Perpetual raid, so she isn't completely powerless. However, it's clear that she's begun to shed Vex, and in the process, she's become even more brazen. Brazen enough, in fact, to raid the tower at the beginning of Ash and Iron, and to look for more means of establishing further control over the network of Vex that she still has. This is why she's been going after Golden Age tech, and in particular perhaps what is left of Siva. As a result, she's also had to supplement her Vex forces with Red Legion forces and compelled cabal from other timelines. In the grand scheme of things, this might seem like Maya is gaining ground rather than losing it, but this is just a perspective issue. She is slowly starting to shed the Vex under her command unit by unit, and this has led to this point where the Vex have become more independent than ever. Some of them have discovered freedom and are making choices for themselves. Thus enter the choices to acquire drip and conduct some crime. That doubtless led to the formation of the new syndicate of Vex on Mars that we'll be working with in Renegades. They are known as Tharsis Reformation. This syndicate's entire name might actually be a hint to its greater purpose and function as well. You see, Vex subtypes are often named in a manner that does this. It displays their function. For example, the Hazen Offensive are found outside of the Vault of Glass on Venus and are responsible for pushing back against potential incursions and drawing the attention of the enemy somewhere else. They go on the attack. This allows the Vex within the Vault of Glass, the Hazen Protective, to better focus on defending the vault and ensuring that no one can enter within. The Sol Divisive were appropriately named as well, given that their entire decision to align with the Witness was quite literally a divisive one that caused other Vex subtypes to quite literally choose to avoid them, rather than interact with them. Tharsis Reformation seems to be another faction or subtype of Vex that specifically tells us its purpose within its name. Tharsis is an area on Mars, not just the area of Tharsis Junction within the old city of Freehold, but also the greater area on Mars itself. Reformation implies that these Vex are attempting to reconstitute their forces, territory, or perhaps even just their people into a group that's located around the Tharsis area. In other words, these Vex are independent, but they're trying to stake a claim over Martian territory at large. It might seem strange, but in a certain way, if we do have to work with any faction of Vex, I find this one to be the most sympathetic. They've just discovered freedom for the first time only recently, and they're trying to band together to make the best of it. There might well still be some sinister perspectives, objectives, or whatever you have behind those angry red eyes, but it's also possible that they're just trying to carve out a place where they can live and follow their own aspirations. After all, isn't that everyone's dream? To just be able to live and, well, follow whatever you wish to do. Do what you will with your life. In a world that has taught them to carve out such a path with violence, it seems only logical that they'd look to form something akin to a criminal syndicate to do so. There's a lot we still do not understand about Tharsis Reformation, but the basics are all there, and they make for a fascinating addition to the universe of Destiny. More importantly, though, they continue the trend of a particular story element coming to the forefront for the Vex. Namely, they bring closer the possibility of the Vex having heroes, villains, characters at large. For the longest time, this has been a big problem for the Vex, and it's one I've talked about for a while actually. The Vex have been a boring faction to face up against in a grander scale because they don't have major named characters that could be their villains or even heroes. Take a look at, say, the Cabal. We have heroes like Keitel, we had villains like Dominus Gaul and Emperor Callus. Now take a look at the Vex. I think the closest we got were characters such as Atheon from the Vault of Glass, Panoptes from Curse of Osiris, and Coria from the Books of Sorrow and Season of the Splicer. You could count some raid bosses amongst their number too, because I imagine that there are people who really think fondly of some of them. Argos, Koragos, maybe even the Sanctified Mind and Consecrated Mind from the Sol Divisive and Garden of Salvation. But let's be honest, none of them really have any big story relevance beyond their specific raid moments. Technically, even Atheon doesn't hit this mark because, well, Atheon's story really only matters because of Praedith, Kabir, and Pahanin, and because it was the first raid boss. The point is, none of these characters really made an impact except maybe for Panoptes, and probably for Coria. It's really hard to make good villains, heroes, or even just interesting characters out of the Vex. But now we have Sharp Cheddar. Now we have Tharsis Reformation. We have individual Vex with individual goals and aspirations, and we even have them forming into their first proper faction. This gives them the narrative room that they need in order to become villains, heroes, or characters that we can invest in at last. It's taken about 10 years of plot development for us to get there, but at last, we might actually see some interesting Vex characters that aren't just Vex that are taken, or Vex that have a particular vendetta against individuals. Maybe I was a little harsh to the Vex here. Maybe you can also take a look at Agioctis, the individual martyr mind that went after Saint 14, but even then, I don't know, man. Are we really sitting there and waxing lyrical about how phenomenal the beef between those two was? Because honestly, Agioctis might as well have been a computer. All the Vex might as well have been computers for all the talking they did. Now the Vex are actually reaching out to us and communicating, and that makes them interesting. I also think this gives the possibility that the mainline Vex that are still following the pattern could be more interesting as well, because now we have the opportunity to cast them in opposition to smaller rogue factions that have found their independence. We've also seen them responding to Maya Sundaresh for the first time ever as a whole, which means we might see a greater voice emerging to speak for the entirety of the Vex. And if that does happen, suddenly we have a real villain on our hands. This is a narrative direction that Bungie has been pushing for a while, and I'm really excited to see it actually manifest, because again, it takes one of the more boring enemies that we could be facing up against outside of the massive cosmic horror that they represent, and it puts a face on them. It gives them goals and aspirations and an oriented need for something, even if we can't necessarily discern what that is. Farsis Reformation has some cool lore, and it takes the Destiny universe in a cool direction, and for that, it gets my seal of approval and a certified... Hey, that's neat. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead and leave a like, and let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments section. Tell me, are you interested in working for Tharsis Reformation? Personally, I'm fascinated, but maybe it doesn't grab you quite yet until you've heard more. Let me know your thoughts down below. Of course, if you want more Destiny content and more lore from universes near and far, remember to hit subscribe and the bell next to subscribe to turn on email notifications. But as per usual, know that your viewership as always has been quite enough for me, and that in the meantime, my name is Byf. Per audacia ad astra. I'll see you, Starside.